So that's all well and good, but we know very well that development has not been sustainable. We're exploring the environment. Things are getting worse in terms of let's look at population growth, right? So if we look at the annual growth rate here on the y-axis on the left here, and the number of people in the world over here on the right, and then now, slightly differently than the other graphs we looked at, we're going to start at 1750, but we're actually going to end over here at 2100. So these are projections, and this is where we are right now. So the dark part is what we have observed, and the light part is what we expect. So you can see here that the growth rate of population, it did indeed spike, right? So the population of the world really started spiking here in 1925, and that's because this is when sort of the middle income or the poor countries started catching up to the rich countries, all over the world. We saw this huge growth rate in population. This is the annual growth rate. This is 2% a year, okay, so that's what that means. If the population is growing at 2% a year, then by the rule of 72, we'd expect the population of the world to double every 36 years. But since around 1970, the growth rate of population has been falling. Okay, so what we see is that it's been falling, and it's been falling quite dramatically over time. This is where we are now, and projections show that this will actually continue falling. And the reason why is because it turns out that as people get richer, they tend to do what maybe the first economist to say something that was, to apply thinking from economics to problems that typically were not the domain of economics, was an economist named Gary Becker. And one of his first things that he talked about was the quality-quantity trade-off in children. So as in particular, as women's time, but also men's time became more valuable in the workplace, they tended to trade off many children that they spent less money on to fewer children that they spent more money on. So there's been a quality-quantity trade-off, and that's really what you're seeing here, is that richer people tend to have fewer children. So, why am I showing it now? Because you might think that population is related to the environment. There's only a limited amount of resources in the earth, so the more people there are, the fewer resources there are per person. All right, so here is the graph showing pollution. So down at the bottom here we have 1970. Here's my little cursor. There it is. So it goes 1970 to 2014 for some, 2018 for others. And what we see is, this is the percentage change in emissions of various types of pollutants. So we have, like, say, where is it now? Emissions are down here. CO2 in particular is there. Energy use is here. And then this is vehicle miles driven. This is percentage change, and this is, so what we're doing is we're normalizing 1970 to be the same for all of these, and we're seeing how they changed it in a percentage way since 1970. So GDP since 1970, it was twice as much as 1970 and 1995, and then it was 3 times as much in 2010. Around the world, population was about half as much again in 2010 as it was in 1970. And CO2 emissions, they followed population up until about 2007, and then they kind of started dropping a little bit relative to population as more and more green energy started being used. And then down here, you see that emissions actually dropped per person quite dramatically. So this is due to things like better filters on cars, and also government policy, for instance, to limit the forget what they're called, but the CFCs, the carbon fluorocarbons, what is it, in spray cans that were causing a hole in the ozone layer. That was limited by regulation in the mid 1980s. Actually, you can see it here. There's a big drop here, so that might actually be an important contributor to this drop in emissions overall. So pollution, actually, it's true that it's been increasing relative to 1970 for CO2, but for other ways of measuring it, it's been decreasing. And then per capita, so this is the CO2 emissions per dollar, not per capita, but per dollar of GDP. And you can see that actually that reached a high in about 1960, and it's actually been falling since. This isn't that surprising because there's a really interesting body of research which I associate with an economist named Andrew McAfee. I'm going to spell it wrong now. I think it's 2 F's, like that, Andrew McAfee. And he talks about how more and more of what we value is not physical. So, it takes CO2 to build things that are physical. Concrete in particular uses a lot of CO2. But I think he calls it dematerialization. Materialization of the economy. So it turns out that over time, what we value is actually things like services that don't take so much CO2, and even more so, we're improving the quality of things that we consume. So maybe in 1950 we might have consumed just as much coffee as we consume in 2020, but the coffee that we consume is higher quality today, so it's worth more. Okay, so that's kind of what he means here, and that's what's behind this graph, is that it doesn't matter whether you grow a high quality coffee bean or a low quality coffee bean, the amount of CO2 that's emitted is not that much different. Oil spills, you can kind of start flipping through these maybe a little bit more quickly, but even as we've increased the amount of oil that we ship, the amount of oil that's spilled has been going down for many years, since 1970. Even as we have grown, deforestation, you probably know that, at least I know that in Pennsylvania, where I went, did my PhD, almost all of the trees all over Pennsylvania were chopped down in this period. So here's 17th century, 18th century. So, this is a period when there's tons and tons of chopping down trees. That's falling over time as we start using less and less wood in our economies, more and more concrete, trees start being protected. Tropical forests, this is something that, especially in, when I was a kid in the 1980s and 90s, people were talking about how the tropical forests were being chopped down for slash and burn farming. That's true. So deforestation in tropical forests was actually rising until around 1975, but since then it's dramatically fallen, partly, again, through efforts of government regulation, what you can do. But anyway, so the point is, deforestation is actually going down, not up, today. Natural disasters, well, how are you going to measure that? What we're looking at here is deaths per person, per 100,000 people per year due to natural disasters, not the number of natural disasters themselves. And unsurprisingly, that's something that's also falling over time, falling quite dramatically. Our lives are becoming more and more safe. Building regulations help with that, for example. Protected areas, so we look at how many areas of countries are protected. This is for the United States. There's more and more protection of natural beauty, if you like. Okay, fine. So it's true, the environment, there's some challenges, obviously. Climate change is a big challenge that we need to talk about. In fact, in this course, we might talk about it a little bit more. But things aren't quite as bad as you might think. So that's fine. But what about terrorism? Failed states, nuclear weapons, civil wars. The world is becoming more violent. Let's see how true that is. You can probably guess. If we look at deaths per 100,000 people, this is kind of a weird graph. You can see that almost everything on the graph is below this point. So let's look at terrorism in places that are not at war. In Western Europe in 1970, in the world, it was extremely low. In Western Europe, they had a spike in terrorism in the 1970s and 80s. Actually, don't know much about why that is, but they did. In the entire world, the spike happened a little bit later. And in the United States, there's been very, very low rates of terrorism, except for this one big spike here, which is 9/11, the Twin Towers, and then basically zero since. In Western Europe, even as you might think there's lots of things, this maybe is there was a London subway bombing that was that had a lot of deaths, so that might be what this is here. Generally, terrorism has actually been falling all over the world and is actually at quite low levels. The whole point about terrorism, as I'm sure you've heard many times before, is that it makes you scared that you could be next. But actually, the number of deaths per 100,000 people is extremely low. The likelihood of dying from a terrorist attack is extremely, extremely low today, and even lower than it was in, say, 1990. All right. What about wars, actual wars? So here are battle deaths per 100,000 people per year. So, obviously this starts here in 1945 because we want to actually see something on this graph. Otherwise, World War II would be way, way, way up here. But we see a drop. So there's civil war in China, there's the Korean War, there's wars going on in this period, there's a drop. Then the Vietnam War picks up, causes more battle deaths here. This is probably the Soviet war in Afghanistan in this period. But then basically since then, there's been actually very few battle deaths per capita. War seems more real to us because we see it on TV, YouTube. I mean, you can watch videos of actual, battles all the time coming out of Syria and on YouTube. So the wars feel more tangible, but actually in terms of numbers of people, the share of people that are dying in battle, it's actually far, far fewer than it was even in the recent past. Number of great power wars, well, basically there haven't been any great power wars since where two big powerful countries are fighting each other. It's happened by proxy, but it hasn't happened actually for a long, long time. You can see this is 1500 here. This map is going back much farther or the graph is going back much farther than the other ones we've been looking at. So here, World War II is in here somewhere, and then basically this is maybe 1970, so the Cold War. Basically since 1970, there haven't been any great power wars, and there still haven't been. Nuclear weapons, maybe one of the scariest things is, we actually have the potential as human beings to potentially wipe out the human race. This is nuclear weapons by country. The point here is that it's all falling quite dramatically in numbers since around 1985. If we kept graphing this, actually, I think there would actually be a slight uptick because both Russia and the United States started stockpiling more nuclear weapons since 2015. The other thing to mention is, it's not just how many weapons there are, it's also the number of countries that have weapons, and it looks like we're going to be adding some here, in particular North Korea, in the not too distant future. Genocide, so here are the number of deaths per 100,000 people, starting in 1955 and going until now. There's a spike here in the 1960s and 70s. This one must be the Khmer Rouge. I don't know. Rwanda is here. This must be Rwanda. But there really haven't been any genocides since 2005. And homicides. So maybe this one is surprising, but the number of people that are being killed in homicides has been decreasing since the 1960s. Well, I should say it's been decreasing in the United States and the world, but in England it actually has been flat, or if anything, well, it's been decreasing a little bit since the mid-2000s, but not too much change. In the United States it's going down a lot since the 1990s. In the world it's going down as well. This one is the crazy one. Homicide's historical. So this is looking way, way back. This is looking back to like 1300, and I don't actually know how they do this in the data. This is Steven Pinker's got a book before Enlightenment now, where he looks more at this violent deaths and homicides. And here's the homicides per 100,000 people per year, so the share of people killed by homicide, if you like. And you can just see this is falling a lot. Even the most violent places, Mexico, they pale before Italy in 1450. So this is per year. Okay, so let's do a simple calculation here. 1,000 people per year would be 1%. Okay, so what this says is that you've got, and then there's 10 years in a decade. So if this was 100, that would be every decade you've got a 1% chance of dying of a homicide, which is pretty crazy, right? So this says every 2 decades you've got a 1% chance of dying from a homicide. So let's see here. So if you lived for 60 years or 50 years, no, say 60 years, so then you have 3 sets of 2 decades together. That means you've got a 3% chance of dying of a homicide in your lifetime. Did I do that right? Or is it like this? 3%. That looks better. You've got a 3% chance of dying of homicide in Italy in 1400 in your lifetime, and the same around in Belgium, a little bit less in England, maybe a 1.5% chance of dying of a homicide. Whereas today, basically, you'd be extremely unlucky in any of those countries to die of a homicide. Here in Mexico, it's about the same as England in 1400 though, so I guess in Mexico you've got about a 1.5 chance, or you did. I mean, this isn't constant, right? It's falling, but suppose that it was constant at this level, then you would have a 1.5% chance, 1.5% chance of dying of a homicide in your lifetime, which is pretty crazy, pretty high. But there you go. Falling all over the world is the point. Executions going down. A few barbaric places still have it. United States and Saudi Arabia, and China as well as a place where they have lots of executions. Domestic violence, rape and sexual assault, both dramatically decreasing even since 1990 in the world, of course. Since 1995. Bullying, that's also becoming, even though it's one of those things where we're talking about it more, and it's because we think it's so wrong. So that's falling over time as well. And let me just stop it there so this video doesn't get too long.